Mika, is it what David said, that we should be hearing from the National Security Advisor, who was not in that meeting and should have been in that meeting, or do you want to hear from the interpreter?
I think it's actually more important to hear from the interpreter, because the Russian Foreign Ministry said that the two presidents agreed to something in that meeting and that they stand by as ready to implement what that is, and we have no idea what the two presidents talked about. The National Security Advisor typically does not appear in front of Congress, and especially because he wasn't in the room, you want to hear from someone who was in the room. That's a lower level executive branch official, and Congress is certainly within its rights to call that person.
What are the concerns about what Donald Trump may have said? What would be the topmost worry for lawmakers, Mika, that Donald Trump may have agreed to behind closed doors with Vladimir Putin?
Well, the number one worry for me, working with intelligence agencies, is that he agreed to Putin's proposal that they work hand in glove with the Mueller investigators or the FBI to understand how exactly U.S. investigators figured out what the Russians were up to. Of course the Russians want to know how we caught them. And of course Putin wants to know so that they can hide better the next time. But that is giving up our sources and methods and deals a tremendous blow to U.S. national security. To me, if the president agreed to that, he is undermining our entire intelligence apparatus.
John, just to remind everybody watching at home what Dan Coats, the DNI, said after Donald Trump had that news conference with Vladimir Putin. He released a statement that was not sanctioned by the White House, but he released a statement that underscored the intelligence community's assessment of what Russia did during the election. Here's what he said. "We have been clear in our assessments of Russian meddling in 2016 election, and their ongoing, repeat, ongoing, pervasive efforts to undermine our democracy, and we will continue to provide unvarnished and objective intelligence in support of our national security." Again, this is DNI Coats on Monday. Donald Trump comes out yesterday, tries to correct everything with the change of one word, and then today he is asked by a reporter if Russia is still meddling. He says no. His director of national intelligence, the top intelligence officer in this administration, a man he put in that job, says no, that is not true. They are still meddling right now. What does DNI Coats do, John?
Yeah, I want to be careful about telling DNI Coats what to do, but he's in an incredibly bad position. But he's also been in a bad position for a long time. He oversees the FBI, he oversees the CIA, he oversees the NSA, and the president's been saying amazingly disparaging things about those places for a long time, and nary a word from the DNI. So at some point, you know, this is what President Trump has done for his entire business career, and clearly during his time in the White House, is he gets other people involved in his conspiracies, he makes them say things that aren't true, and then they're sort of stuck. And so Mr. Coats has a tough position to be in. I mean, he oversees the intelligence community. He probably worries, like any good public servant would be, that if he leaves, a partisan could come in and make things worse. But he's going to have to make a hard decision here.
Let me ask you this. Say that the administration stops working hand in hand with the president. They do their own thing. Is it possible to adequately protect our election systems if you don't have buy-in publicly from the president?
Well, when I worked in the government, we used to talk about an all-of-government approach. And the only way to solve the big problems in this country is when everybody's moving in the same direction. And what we have here really is a very bifurcated and crazy system where it seems to be that the executive branch, for the most part, is doing sensible things and moving forward, and the President of the United States is doing things that border on lunacy, and there doesn't seem to be a connection. At least it's not clear what that connection is. So this is a real problem, I think, and it's going to continue to be a problem as long as Donald Trump does these things and goes out on his own. I don't think, in fact, he probably should have even gone to that summit and nonetheless say the things he did afterwards.
Mika, is there any way for him to walk this back?
I mean, it would require a total reversal of a number of things that he's been saying over many years. If he's serious about walking this back, then he should stop interfering with the Mueller investigation. He should put more resources against holding the Russians accountable. He should be considering fully implementing the sanctions that Congress has put in place. But his actions speak louder than his words, and his words are all over the place right now.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.